Buenas tardes con todos o buenos
Good
días para los que
afternoon
están
or
de
good
mañana.
morning for those of you who
Soy
are still
Carla
somewhere where
Sáenz,
it's still the
soy
morning.
asesora
I'm
regional
Carla
de
Sáenz,
bioética de la
Regional
OMS.
Advisor of Bioethics at
Es
PAHO.
un gusto
And
darles la
it's a pleasure
bienvenida
to
el día de
welcome
hoy
you
a
today
nuestro nuevo
to our
seminario virtual
new
sobre
virtual
temas
seminar on
relacionados con los ensayos
topics
clínicos.
related to clinical assays.
Antes de dar más detalles
Before
sobre la
giving you
sesión
any
de
more
hoy,
details about today's
quiero
session, I would like
hacerles
to
saber que tendremos
inform you that we
presentaciones
will
en
have a
inglés.
presentation
Por lo tanto,
in English.
aquellos que
So
quieran
those of you
escuchar
who
la
wish to
traducción
hear the
de inglés al
translation
español
from
o
English to
escuchar de
Spanish
español en inglés,
or from Spanish
vayan
to
por
English,
favor
whichever way,
a la
please go
señal
down to
de
the
globo
little
que
globe at the
está
bottom of your
donde dice
screen where it says
interpretación en la
interpretation.
parte baja
As
de
I
la
said, it's
pestaña
at the lower
inferior
part
hacia la derecha
of your
de
screen on the right.
su pantalla del Zoom. I'm going to say this in English now. So please, those of you that want to listen to this seminar in English, please go to the tab that's at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen, and click on a little globe that says interpretation, and then click on English. Ok, retornamos al español entonces. Bienvenidos a esta nueva sesión
Welcome
de
to this
nuestra
new
serie de
session
seminarios
of our
virtuales sobre temas
virtual
relacionados con los
seminars on
ensayos
topics related to clinical
Estos
essays.
seminarios son
These are
coorganizados por el Programa
co-organized
Regional de Bioética que hace parte de la Unidad de Ciencia y
by the
Conocimiento
Bioethics
para el impacto
division that
del Departamento de
considers the
Ciencia
impact
e
of the
Inteligencia para
Evidence
la
and
Acción en
Intelligence
Salud de
Department
la
for
OMS
Action and Health
y la
of
Unidad
PAHO,
de Calidad y
and the
Regulación de Medicamentos
regulation
en
and
la
quality
Organización
aspects of
Sanitaria de la
medications and
OMS,
health technologies
que
of
es parte
PAHO,
del Departamento
which
de
is part of
Innovación,
the
Acceso a Medicamentos
Innovation,
y
Access to
Tecnologías
Medications and
Sanitarias.
Technologies and Health Technologies
A fin
Unit.
de organizarnos a lo
In
largo
order
de la
to
sesión,
organize the
les
session,
pido encarecidamente que
I would like to
agreguen
ask you
cualquier
that you
pregunta que
add any
tengan
questions you may have
usando la funcionalidad de
using
preguntas y
the
respuestas de
function of
Zoom.
the questions and answers of
Si
Zoom.
tienen
If
comentarios
you
o
have any
quieren compartir
comments
alguna
or you wish to
publicación o
share
algún
any
enlace de
publication
interés, por
or any
favor usen
link that
para
may be
eso
of
la
interest,
funcionalidad
please
del chat.
use the
Es decir,
chat.
entre preguntas y comentarios nos hace más fácil
It's always
organizar el
easier to
diálogo
distinguish
que
between
tenemos
comments
y
and
que
questions to
tendremos
organize our dialogue, which is
luego
going to take
al
place
final
at
de
the end
esta sesión.
after the presentation.
Quiero resaltar
I
que
would like to
no
highlight that
se emitirá un certificado
there
por
will be
asistir
no
a este seminario.
certificate for attending this
No
seminar.
daremos un
We will
certificado de
not be
asistencia.
granting an
Vamos a
assistance
grabar la
certificate. We're going to
sesión
be
como lo
recording the
hacemos
session as we
regularmente
always
y
do,
tanto esta grabación
and
como los
both the
seminarios, la grabación de
recording
los
and
seminarios
the
previos y el
recordings
anuncio de
of
los
past
próximos
seminars and the
seminarios
announcement of
serán
future seminars will
compartidos
be
por nuestra
shared
lista
by
Investigación
our
Ética.
ethical research
Estarán
list,
además disponibles en el
and
sitio web
they
del
will be
Programa
available
Regional de
in the
Bioética
website
y en nuestro portal de
of the
ensayos
Bioethics
clínicos,
division
donde también
and
pueden
the
encontrar otros
Clinical Assays
recursos
portal, where you can find other
importantes
important
como
resources
el
such as
modelo de
the
contratos de ensayos clínicos que
clinical
hemos
assay
preparado en la
contract
región
model that we've prepared for the region,
y bueno, una serie de
and
recursos
a
adicionales
series
que
of
tenemos.
additional resources that
Quiero
are
además
available.
dejarles saber
I
que
also want to
este
inform you
es
that
nuestro último
this is the
seminario
last seminar of
de este año.
this year. We
Reanudaremos,
will
perdón, los seminarios
resume the seminars
el 2026
in 2026.
y queremos aprovechar esta oportunidad
And
para
we want to
reiterar
take advantage of this
que estos
opportunity to
seminarios, desde que los
repeat that
iniciamos, y me refiero
from when we
específicamente a
began the
esta
seminars, and
serie
I'm referring
relacionada a
specifically
ensayos
to this
clínicos,
series
tuvimos
of
ya más de
clinical assays,
4.500
specifically, it's had more than
asistentes, y
4,500
por
attendants,
supuesto sin
which
contar
of
todas las
course
personas
is
que se nos
not counting all the people that
unieran al
have
seminario
seen the
luego
seminar
una vez de que
after
está
the
disponible
actual
en el sitio
presentations,
web por
once
medio
it's
del
available on the
enlace de
website
YouTube.
through the YouTube link.
Ya que estamos
And
hablando de temas de fin
since
de
we're
año,
talking about
quiero
end of the year things,
aprovechar de
I want to take
desearles
advantage to wish
lo
you
mejor en estas
all the
fiestas, lo
best for
mejor para el
the upcoming
2026
holidays,
y
the best for
anticiparles que el inicio
2026,
del 2026
and
vendrá con el
let you know that the
lanzamiento de
beginning of the
muchos
2026 will have
proyectos, de muchos
launching of
productos en
many
los que hemos trabajado
products
durante
and
este año
projects we've been
y que
working
están
on this year,
relacionados a
related
iniciativa de
to
UPS,
the
el acelerador
PAHO
ensayos
initiative
clínicos.
of the Clinical
Además,
Assays
los
Accelerator.
proyectos en los que
The
trabajaremos en el
projects that we will be
2026
working with in
incluyen
2026 will
una
include
orientación para los protocolos
guidance
preaprobados,
for the
que como
pre-approved
recordarán
protocols,
es
which
un
is,
tema que ha
as you
sido
recall, is
identificado
a
como
topic that has been
prioritario por
identified as a
ustedes
priority
y,
by all of you and
capturado como tal en
is
el
captured as
en nuestra
such
orientación catalizar la investigación en
in
las
our
emergencias. Este es un proyecto en el
orientation to
que
catalyze clinical
trabajaremos
assays.
de manera
This is
coordinada
something that we
con
will be
CIMAC.
working with in a coordinated
Ahora
manner
bien,
together with
para
Sergio.
la sesión de hoy,
Now, for today's
pensamos
session,
que no
we think
podíamos
that
dejar pasar
we
una
had to
reflexión sobre la
comment
inteligencia
on the
artificial
artificial
y el papel que
intelligence
tiene en
and
la
the role
revisión
it
ética de
plays
la
in the ethical
investigación.
review of
Creo que es
research.
imperativo
I
que
think it's imperative
iniciemos
that
esta
we
reflexión lo antes
begin this
posible
as soon as
y no
possible.
sé si quizás el término
And
es
I don't
anticiparnos o
know if the
tratar de
word,
anticiparnos,
correct
por lo
word would
menos
be to
tomar la ola que
anticipate
está
or
avanzando
maybe
ya
ride the wave
en
that's
relación a
already
este tema, teniendo
riding,
presente que tenemos
bearing in
la
mind that
urgencia de hacer el mejor
we
uso de los
must
recursos
do
disponibles
everything
para
possible to make
asegurar que
use
haya
of
una
the
revisión ética
available resources so that we
rigurosa
can make
de
sure
los
that there's a
protocolos de
rigorous
investigación con seres humanos.
review of the
No puedo
protocols using
iniciar
human
esta
beings.
sesión sin
I can't begin this
recordarnos
session
que
without
hemos
reminding
recorrido
us
ya
that
un largo
we've already
camino en lo que
traveled a
respecta
long
al
journey
uso de
regarding
herramientas
the use
novedosas
of
para
novel
mejorar no
tools to
solamente la
improve
revisión
not only
ética de
the
la
ethical
investigación con
review
seres
of
humanos,
research
sino
with human
también
beings,
los
but
procesos
also
para realizar
the
investigación con
processes
seres humanos.
for the
Por ejemplo,
tests
usamos
with
ahora
human
herramientas
beings. For example,
digitales
today we're
para
using
la
digital tools
gestión de los procesos de
to
revisión,
manage the
por
review
ejemplo,
processes
Proetos,
like
y
Proetos.
usamos una serie
And
de
we use a series
herramientas
of
digitales y
digital
mecanismos
tools
novedosos
or novel
para procesos de
mechanisms to
consentimiento informado, para las
do with
reuniones de
the
los
consent
comités de ética,
informed
para
consent, the
recoger,
bioethics
usar y
reviews,
compartir
the collection and
información.
sharing of
La
information.
pandemia de
The
COVID-19
COVID-19
nos
pandemic
hizo ver de manera inequívoca que
showed
los
us
comités de ética de la
evidently
investigación
that
están
the ethics committees
absolutamente
in research are
sobrepasados de tiempo
exceeded
y que tenemos la
time-wise,
urgencia de
and that
hacer
we
el uso
have
más
the
responsable de los
need to
recursos
make
que
a really
tenemos a mano
responsible use of
para
the
que los
resources we
comités
have
puedan
available so
hacer
that these
una
committees can
revisión ética juiciosa
review
y rigurosa.
these rigorously and
Como siempre
carefully.
decimos en la
As we
OPS, la
always say at
investigación
PAHO,
no es
research
una tarea
is not
éticamente neutra.
an
Se
ethically
hace
neutral
investigación
job.
para la salud,
We research
para
for
buscar
health. We
soluciones
research to
que
find
mejoren la salud y
solutions
el
that can
bienestar de
improve the
las
health and
personas, soluciones de
well-being
salud.
of people, health
Entonces,
solutions.
como tenemos el
So,
imperativo de
since
hacer
we find that there
investigación
is the
por este
need
fin,
for
también
research,
tenemos el
we must
imperativo de que
also
esta
have the
investigación
need
se haga de la manera
to
más
do
ágil
it
posible y
as
creo que esta
fast as possible,
reflexión
as agile
es
as possible. And I think
fundamental
that this
y
is a
necesaria.
fundamental
Y quiero
consideration.
en esta reflexión, el
And
día de hoy,
here
vamos a tener
today,
una presentación
we're
a
going to
cargo
have
del
a
doctor Sergio
presentation by
Surugi de
Dr.
Siqueira
Sergio
y luego
Surugi
vamos a
de
tener
Siqueira, and then
un
we'll hear
panel
comments from
de
a panel
distintas,
of
con distintas perspectivas de
different
la región
perspectives from the
para
region
reflexionar
so that we
sobre
can
las
reflect
posibilidades y
on
los
the
desafíos
possibilities
del
and
uso de la
challenges of the
inteligencia
use of
artificial
AI,
al hacer
artificial
revisión ética
intelligence,
de la
in
investigación.
doing an ethical
No creo
review
que haya
of
mejor
research.
manera que de
What better
iniciar.
way than
No creo
to,
que haya mejor persona para
or
hacer
what
esta
better person, I
presentación
should
que
say,
el
to do
doctor
this
Sergio
presentation
Surugi
than
de
Dr.
Siqueira,
Sergio
que
Surugi de
al que
Siqueira,
ustedes conocen. Él es
whom you
miembro
know.
externo del
He's
PAHO ERC, del Comité de Ética de la
a member
UPS, ha
of the
sido
Ethical Committee
profesor
of
de la
PAHO. He's been
Pontificia
professor of the
Universidad Católica
Pontificia
de
Universidad
Paraná en
Católica in
Brasil,
Paraná in
ha sido
Brazil.
miembro
He's been a
del
member of
CONEP, del
CONEP,
Consejo Nacional
which
de
is the
Ética de la
National Ethics
Investigación
and Research
de Brasil,
Council in Brazil.
pero quizás más
But
relevante para el día de
maybe
hoy
what's more
es que
relevant
él ha
today
sido el
is that
artífice
he's
de la
been
plataforma
the
Brasil, que
designer
hace más
of
de
the Brazil
12
platform,
años
which
ya
I think has
usan
more
todos
than
los
12
comités
years,
de
where the
ética
ethics
de
committees
investigación
are
en
using
Brasil
this
y
platform for
además
research in Brazil.
es
And
artífice también
he's
de
also
Proetos y creo que es alguien
designed
que ha
Proetos,
tenido un papel
someone who's
fundamental en la
had a
región,
key role in the
forzándonos
region,
a pensar
in
en
fact,
cómo
forcing us
hacer
to think
mejor la revisión
how
ética
to
usando
do
los
ethical
recursos más
reviews
novedosos que
using the
la
most novel
tecnología nos pone a
resources we
disposición.
have
Es
available.
un gusto tenerte con
It's a
nosotros
pleasure to
el
have
día
you
de
with
hoy.
us, Sergio, today.
Adelante, Sergio, y muchas gracias.
You have the floor, and thank you.
Muchas gracias, Carla, por
Thank
la
you, Carla, for
presentación.
that
Muchas
presentation.
gracias por
And
la
thank you
invitación.
for the
Es un gusto
invitation.
estar
It's
con
a
ustedes
pleasure to
ahora.
be here
Yo
with
voy
you today.
entonces a compartir mi presentación.
I'm going to share my presentation with you now.
Así se, a ver. ¿La pueden ver bien?
Can you see the presentation?
Perfecto.
Yes, perfect.
Sí, muy bien.
Very well,
Bueno,
then
entonces empecemos
I'll begin
para que tengamos tiempo para todas las intervenciones
so that we'll have
sobre
time for all the other
por supuesto,
interventions,
muy
which
importantes.
we know are very
Y vamos
important.
a hablar entonces de inteligencia
And we'll speak
artificial,
of artificial
revisión
intelligence and ethical
de
review
investigación,
of the
los
research
desafíos y oportunidades.
challenges and
Bueno,
opportunities.
ahí está un disclaimer,
And here we have a
porque
disclaimer
es
because
importante
it is
tener
important
en cuenta
to bear in mind
potenciales conflictos de
the
intereses
potential
y
conflicts
también
of
decir que
interest,
las opiniones
and say
expresadas
also
son
that the
personales,
opinions expressed here
no
are my own
representan
and
posición
do not
oficial de la
represent the official position of the
OPS
Pan American Health
o ninguna
Organization
otra
or any
institución.
other
Bueno,
institution.
seguimos entonces.
But I'll
Bueno,
continue.
¿qué vamos a hacer
So,
en esta presentación?
what are we going to do with
Primero,
this presentation?
explorar
First,
cómo
we're
la
going to
inteligencia
explore
artificial
how artificial
puede
intelligence
apoyar,
can
y ahí
support,
un término muy
and this is a
importante,
very
apoyar
important term,
la
support
revisión ética.
ethical reviews.
Después vamos a identificar
And then we're going to
algunos
identify
desafíos
some of
tanto del
the
punto de vista, desde el punto de
challenges
vista ético
from the
como
ethical as well as
técnico,
technical point of
y
view.
presentar
And I'll
oportunidades
talk about some
reales
real
de
opportunities
utilización de la
of
inteligencia
how to use
artificial
artificial
en ética de
intelligence
investigación
in
y por
the
fin compartir
research,
un
and
aprendizaje que viene
then
de un
share
proyecto
some
que ya
learning that comes
existe
from a
y que
project that already
está
exists
listo para ser
and which is
evaluado
ready to be
y
evaluated, in
que a lo
fact.
mejor ustedes
And maybe
conocer hoy por la
you
primera
may
vez.
get to hear of it for the
Seguimos
first time
entonces.
today. We'll
¿Por
continue.
qué hablar
So,
de inteligencia
why do we
artificial
speak of
en
artificial
ética de
intelligence
investigación?
and
Bueno, Carla
ethics
ya
in
ha dado
research?
la principal
Carla has actually already given you the main
de la
reason
necesidad
for
de
this
que no se puede
need,
ignorar
is
la ética, la
reminding us that we
inteligencia
cannot
artificial en ética de
ignore
investigación.
artificial
Bueno, hay
intelligence in
algunos
research
puntos
ethics,
importantes.
but
Por
there
ejemplo,
are some important items we should consider.
volumen
For example,
más grande
a
y
greater
la
volume
complejidad de
and
los
the
protocolos de
complexity of the
verificación
research
también
protocols
está creciente.
is growing.
Eso ya sería una
That
buena
in
razón
itself would
para
be a good reason
no
to
olvidarnos de la inteligencia
not
artificial,
neglect artificial
porque,
intelligence, because
por supuesto, ella va a
it, of
facilitar
course, is
mucho
going to
la
make
actuación tanto de los
the
investigadores
behavior
como de
of
los comités
researchers
de
as well as
ética
the
de
ethics committees
investigación.
much easier.
Bueno, hay también una
And
necesidad
then
de
there's
hacer
also
las
the
cosas
need
más
to do
ágiles
things
sin
faster
perder el
without
rigor
losing the
de
rigorous
las
nature
evaluaciones
of the
éticas.
ethical
El
evaluations.
otro es que no se puede
The other
ignorar
is
que los
that we cannot
investigadores ya
ignore that
usan
researchers
la
are already
inteligencia
using
artificial generativa
generative
eh,
artificial
como
intelligence
orientación para hacer sus
to guide them
protocolos y
in
sus
their
propuestas.
protocols and
Y
proposals.
por todo eso, los
And
sistemas de
for
ética
all
de
this
investigación
reason,
deben
the
comprender
research
e
ethics system
involucrar en
should
este nuevo escenario.
understand and get involved in this new scenario.
¿Qué es lo que nosotros
So,
entendíamos que puede
what
hacer
do we
hoy la
understand
inteligencia
artificial
artificial?
intelligence can do today?
Explicar principios
First, to
éticos.
explain the ethical
Eso
principles,
parece
which
obvio,
may seem
pero no es
obvious,
así.
but it's not.
Nosotros estamos
We
viendo muchos
are seeing
investigadores juniores y muchos
many junior
estudiantes incluso
researchers and many
que
students, in
presentan
fact,
propuestas,
who
pero
are
no
presenting
conocen
proposals,
en
but
fondo los principios
don't know
éticos.
the ethical
Entonces nosotros
principles in
creemos que la
detail. So we
inteligencia
believe that
artificial
artificial
puede
intelligence can
orientarlos en
guide
ese
them
camino.
in this direction.
Para aquellos que ya están
And for
en
those of you
un
who are
más
already at a
avanzado,
more advanced
es importante
stage,
también que la
it's also
inteligencia
important
artificial
to
pueda
recognize that
identificar
artificial intelligence can
inconsistencias.
identify
Es decir, cosas
inconsistencies,
que
sort of
el
things
investigador,
that
y eso no
the
es raro que
researcher,
pase,
and that's not
piensa
rare,
que están bien,
might think is
pero
correct,
una mirada
but
por la inteligencia
once
artificial puede decir
reviewed by
que no
artificial
están tan
intelligence, they
bien
can see
como
that it's not
uno
as good
piensa.
as one thinks.
El otro es
And the
la
other is
sumarización de documentos
the
extensos. Algunos documentos son muy largos,
summarizing
son muy
of a
complejos
long
y la
document. Some
inteligencia
documents are very
artificial
long
tiene
and
la
very complex,
capacidad
and
de
artificial intelligence is
poner eso
capable
en una
of
forma más, digamos
presenting
así,
it
aceptable para
in a
todos.
much more acceptable way.
También puede
And
ayudar, apoyar
it
a
could
los
also
investigadores
help
en borradores de
researchers
respuestas. Es
in
decir, cuando un
response
comité
drafts. And
cuando
what
un
I mean by
comité
this is when an ethics
detecta y
committee
expresa
detects
algunas
or expresses
inconsistencias,
the existence of inconsistencies in the
Y la
proposal,
inteligencia
and
artificial puede
artificial
apoyar
intelligence can
a los
support the
investigadores para que
researchers
haga una respuesta
to
más
help them
adecuada. Pero
respond
es
more
importante
appropriately.
decir que
But
esto no
what's
es
important is to
un
say that
copy
this
y
is not a
paste,
copy and
no es
paste
esa.
issue. That's
Por lo
not,
menos no es eso
at
que
least,
pensamos
that's
de
not
la
what we
función
think should
de
be
la
the role
inteligencia
of
artificial.
artificial
No es
intelligence.
como un
It's not
instrumento, una
like
plataforma
a
para hacer el
platform
trabajo del
that does
investigador.
the
Es
researcher's
más
work.
bien una
It's more of
guía,
a
una
guide,
directriz que puede
a
guiarlo.
guideline to help
Y
him.
el apoyo
And then the
preanalítico,
pre-analytic support,
aunque
which is
sea no
important,
decisorio,
even though it's not
importante
decisive,
señalar esto,
and it's
porque el
important to
apoyo
mention this because the
preanalítico puede hacer
pre-analytical
con que las
support
propuestas sean
can make sure that
sometidas
the
a los
proposals are
comités de
presented to
ética
the ethics
de una
committees
manera más,
in a
podemos decir, consistente.
more, let's
Y
say,
eso,
consistent
por
way.
supuesto, va a
And of
facilitar
course, that's going to
mucho el
make
trabajo
the
de los
work
comités de
of
ética y
the ethics
investigación que
committees
van a tener propuestas
easier, and they're
que
going to
con
be
menos
receiving proposals that
inconsistencias.
have less inconsistencies.
Pero
But
hay cosas que mucha gente
there are
piensa que
things
la
that
inteligencia
people
artificial
think
puede hacer todo.
artificial
Y
intelligence
yo
can
creo que
do,
desde el punto de
and they
vista de
sometimes think
ética
they
en
can do it
investigación, hay
everything. And
cosas que
sometimes
se
from the
deben
point of view of
señalar como
ethics in
prohibidas
research,
o por lo menos
which should be
no
considered
deseadas
forbidden or maybe
para la
undesired
inteligencia artificial.
for
Por
artificial
ejemplo,
intelligence to do.
no
For example,
aprobar y no
they should not
rechazar
approve or
protocolos.
reject
No
protocols.
es un decision making.
They are not a
No puede hacer eso.
decision-making
Tiene que estar,
entity. They should not act as such.
digamos,
They must
instruida para no
be
hacer eso.
taught not to do
No
that.
debe emitir juicios
They should,
normativos.
artificial intelligence should
Puede,
not
como mucho,
issue
decir que son
standard
las
judgments.
normas
They can
X y
say
las
that these are
otras,
the standards or
pero
what the
la
standards say,
interpretación
but
tiene
the
que tener
actual
mucho cuidado
interpretation
en los límites
has to be
de
very
actuación.
careful as far as the
No
behavioral
interpretar
action.
la legislación como una
It should not
autoridad.
interpret
Por ejemplo, no
legislation
se
as an
puede decir,
authority and
haces
say, oh
eso y
no, if you
vas a
don't do
ser
this, you're going
demandado
to
con no
be
sé
sued
cuánto.
by this or that or
No
whatever.
es esa
That's
la
not the
función
purpose. That's not their
judicial.
role.
De ninguna manera,
At no
por lo menos en mi
time, at least
experiencia,
not
en
from
este
my
momento,
experience
la
at this
inteligencia
time, should
artificial está
artificial intelligence
capacitada para
be in a position to
sustituir la
substitute
deliberación ética humana.
the
Puede
human
sí
ethical
apoyar
deliberation.
mucho,
It could
no hay
support,
ninguna duda,
there's no
exactamente,
doubt about
pero no
that,
sustituye,
but it
por lo
should
menos
not
en este
substitute, at
momento.
least
No se
not at
sabe
this
cómo
time.
va a
We don't know what's
evolucionar
going to happen in the future and
la
how
inteligencia artificial,
artificial
pero en este
intelligence is
momento,
going to evolve. But at
para
this
quien está
time,
trabajando con
for
eso,
those of you working
se
with
queda
it,
muy claro que no es
it's
posible.
very clear that this is not possible.
Y eso todo puede ser
And all
sintetizado en una
this
única
could be
ecuación.
summarized
Es
into
para
a
ser
single word.
utilizada como una
It is to be used
orientación
as
y no
guide,
como una respuesta
not
completamente
as
adecuada, ¿no
a
es cierto?
tailored
Seguimos.
response.
¿Cuáles son los desafíos
What
éticos
are
y
the
principalmente
ethical
aquí yo voy
and
a
here
hablar un
I'm
poco
going
más de
to
los desafíos
talk more
técnicos
about the
que son
technical challenges
inherentes
which
a
are
la inteligencia
inherent
artificial
to artificial
y que
intelligence
tienen que ser
and
vencidos por
should
nosotros,
be
tienen que ser
overcome by us,
abordados por nosotros.
should be
El
dealt
primero
by
es la
us. For
variabilidad,
example,
¿no es cierto?
variability.
Los modelos de inteligencia
The
artificial,
artificial
principalmente
intelligence
los que
models,
son
especially those
eh,
that
relacionados
are
con aquellas
related to
plataformas o aquellas
the
personas que usan la
platform
inteligencia
or people
artificial
who use
que ya
artificial
existen, por
intelligence
ejemplo,
that already
ChatGPT
exist, like
o
ChatGPT
Gemini y
or
otros,
Gemini or
es
others
que de
like that,
repente
is
estas
that
plataformas,
these
estos
platforms or
instrumentos
these instruments,
de
these
inteligencia artificial
artificial
cambian,
intelligence tools
son
suddenly
actualizados.
change and are
Y a
updated.
veces un
And
cambio de esto
sometimes
puede
a change
cambiar
could
totalmente la
change
manera como
the
uno ve que
way
la
in which
inteligencia
we
artificial ve
see
una
or
pregunta
artificial intelligence sees a
o
question
y
completely
emite una
and
respuesta.
how it
Entonces,
issues the
es un problema.
response. So that could be a
El
problem.
otro es un término
The
que
other
se
is a
usa mucho
term
en
that is
inteligencia artificial,
often
los que
used in
conocen muy
artificial
bien,
intelligence, those of
las
you who know, which
hallucinations.
is the
Ah,
hallucinations.
por increíble que pareça,
It may seem
así como los
incredible,
humanos, algunos humanos,
but
la
just like
inteligencia
some humans,
artificial también
artificial
alucina, ¿verdad? A
intelligence
veces
also
inventa
hallucinates
cosas que no
sometimes and
existen,
invents things that don't exist
argumentos
and presents arguments that
totalmente
are
que no hacen ningún
completely
sentido.
senseless.
Entonces, eso es otra cosa
So
que es
that's
un
another
desafío
thing that
para
that could
el
be a
uso de la
challenge
inteligencia
for the use of
artificial en
artificial
investigación.
intelligence in
El otro es la
research
contaminación
ethics.
regulatoria. Ella
The
busca
other is the
marcos
regulatory
regulatorios de
contamination.
distintas
It
fuentes.
searches
Entonces, a
regulatory
veces
frameworks from different sources and often
se mezclan cosas que
could
valen
mix
para un
things
sitio,
that
para
are worthy for one context, one region, one country, but not for another. And the other is that it's not always possible to do an internal alignment with the API. And what I mean by this is that we cannot have API or the artificial intelligence, and I'll explain API in a minute, but that artificial intelligence should have all the alignments or the standards or the ways to decide things adapted 100% to research ethics and all its codes. And this is more important when we use the API. And the API, I'll explain briefly a little later. But the API is when a platform, even though it's specific for research ethics, uses as a basis an existing artificial intelligence like ChatGPT or Gemini, as I said. So we have to consider the risks of privacy. We have to be careful with that as well, because the data, when using artificial intelligence that already exists, sometimes can have no full control over the data that are input into the platform. And then the over-reliance, which is another thing that sometimes shows up, which is when artificial intelligence relies excessively on itself and believes that it can do more than it can actually do. And that is also a problem, because sometimes it gives answers as though they were the top authority and the maximum truth. And when we have a little experience, can realize that they're actually mistaken. And that's for those who have theoretical basis in research ethics, which might not be important because they might ignore it. But if it falls in the hands of someone who has no experience or someone who's not really familiar with the research ethics, that can be a disaster. Now, some specific risks, like the hallucinations that we mentioned, like inventing resolutions or articles or ethical requirements. Sometimes it even generates false ethical arguments, even though they seem reasonable. And that's a tremendous trap, because a person, as I said before, who knows wouldn't have a problem because he'd realize that the argument makes no sense. But if this falls in the hands of someone who knows little about research and ethics, because of the way the answer is presented by artificial intelligence, it could sound as the absolute truth and could lead to mistakes in the research, which could sometimes be very serious, and then to confuse universal principles like the local legislation. Sometimes it loses the idea of what the universal principles are, but they're not usually in conflict with the local legislation, but sometimes they could be. These hallucinations occur because the model predicts linguistic patterns, not truths. It doesn't have a direct reference to the real world. So it searches for words, and with the words, it has an algorithm which reaches conclusions and expresses a response. So the way in which we ask the question of artificial intelligence could influence the response. Hallucinations are predictable, inevitable, as I said, but they're controllable and mitigatable. No artificial intelligence is free of hallucinations. What we have to do is to be in control at all times, checking and controlling and correcting so that these can be reduced to a minimum, but you cannot eliminate them. That's not possible. Then the risk of regulatory contamination is an undesired mixture of references, as I said. The critical risk, especially in weak regulatory contexts where there's not enough clear rules. And most of the times, as I've said, This is not necessarily a problem except under specific circumstances, like, for example, Brazil with the Helsinki Declaration. For years, Brazil didn't sign the Helsinki Declaration, and artificial intelligence used certain items of the Helsinki Declaration, which are not accepted in Brazil, could be a problem, but in a given region or in a given place. So, what can we do to improve the artificial intelligence, specifically for ethics and research in ethics? From the more technical point of view, I'm not an expert here, I'm learning still, but there are certain parameters that can be regulated by the systems manager or administrator, which can have serious influence in the performance of artificial intelligence. First, the temperature. Temperature is related to creativity and to hallucinations. The higher the temperature, the greater the chance or the possibility of having hallucinations. For research ethics, from my experience, I would recommend a temperature of 0.1 to 0.3. Maximum 1, just to give you an idea. And the other parameter is the top P, which controls diversity. In other words, the focus of the response. And in research ethics, we recommend something like 0.3 to 0.6. And this is critical. For you to have an idea, I was working with this and I had a top P of 0.8. And I was finding rare answers, strange answers, sometimes things that were different, that were unnecessary, that were additional. So I tried to lower it to 0.58. And
the difference was really impactful, and it greatly improved the performance of the responses I got from the AI. The max tokens avoid getting distracted and background noise. Sometimes you don't speak too much because in Brazil you say that whoever speaks too much just gives good ideas to horses. So here we could say the same thing about AI, only talk about what is necessary, limit your words. The other thing is the frequency and present penalties, which reduce the repetition of ideas and improve clarity. So these are some of the parameters that one can influence in terms of the response from AI, but it's not so easy to regulate it. Small variations have a great impact on quality, for better or worse. Here we're going to talk a little bit about API, which is Application Programming Interface, and this is specific to research ethics. This uses existing AI, and the other one is proprietary AI, what is produced by highly expert programmers who develop AI for a specific context. Now, what are the advantages of these two? For the API, it's a high linguistic quality. Whoever uses ChatGPT and Gemini and others are aware of this. Integration is also very easy. You could continuously update it and almost automatically improve it and instruct it in terms of the configurations that you want. Also, there is flexibility to combine your own ethics layers. Even if you use something that already exists, you can instruct it to have a regional characteristic, for example, which is unique to that situation. And it's also favorable in terms of cost benefit. The concept of inexpensive or expensive is quite relative, but it is cheaper than the other option we're going to look at. Now, what are the limitations of API? You do not have control over the internal alignment. But in other words, what's there is there, was developed by someone else, but you can have external alignment. And that does somewhat limit that problem. What is external alignment? It is that you instruct the AI for different levels of behavior. Also, model drift can be unpredictable. That means that this AI gets updated, and as I've also said, an authorization might completely change its behavior. So you must always, always be checking it, measuring it, testing it. And if you detect this model drift, sometimes you have to change it and go back to situations that no longer exist. And it also is dependent on external guardrails. Once again, the systems administrator needs to constantly check this and propose some initiatives, some significant initiatives, that is to say, to put limits or guardrails to contain the behavior of the AI. Now, proprietary AI has almost 100% alignment and control over behavior, and it's much more stable and auditable, and this can be adapted to regional or different levels, and it also is adapted to institutional values. Now, the cons are that it is very expensive, and it also has costs in terms of significant infrastructure, and it also requires a specialized team that not only develops it, but also continuously monitors and maintains it. Now, let's talk about API, which is what I have more experience with, and which is what I think is more accessible to everyone now. Let's do a comparison between generic AI, such as ChatGPT and Gemini, which is used by everyone all the time, and specific artificial intelligence, which is developed to respond only to research ethics issues. Generic AI is trained to talk about everything. For example, you might talk about the use of a placebo, ethically talking about a research project, and it also is going to answer the same no matter what the context. It does not understand ethical nuances. It does its own learning, but this is not always have deep understanding. And there is a big risk of pseudo authority between may, should, permitted. This often happens with generic AI. And of course, there is a greater propensity to hallucinations, primarily normative ones, because it confuses everything and sometimes does not look for the proper rule, and this can create problems. Now, specific AI, and that's the example that we're going to look at here through EthExpress, has a controlled vocabulary. It does not talk about everything. For example, if you ask EthExpress about the recipe for a casserole or how your soccer team is doing, it would say that that is not research ethics and it knows nothing about that. So the vocabulary and behavior are controlled. It also has strict guardrails. It does not make decisions and does not set standards or rules. It is more stable and more prudent than general AI, and it is focused on universal principles and regional standards.
Pre-screening y triaje, o sea, puede hacer una evaluación de cómo está tu propuesta antes de someterla. Mejora la calidad de documentos previos a la revisión. No hace revisión, pero te puede apoyar en una sumisión más consistente. Y tiene armonización basada en principios universales, por ejemplo, de la Organización Mundial de Salud, de SIOMS y de la Asociación Médica Mundial. Aí agora vamos, eu creio que estão todos muito, digamos, curiosos para ver um exemplo prático de uma plataforma que já existe, que está fazendo ética en investigación por IA a través de una API y que es específica para ética en investigación. Entonces, el ETA Express, que yo voy a presentar a ustedes. Tiene uso controlado de inteligencia artificial como apoyo preanalítico. Preanalítico. Es importante que se quede muy claro. Tiene módulos distintos según aplicación. Actualmente solo tenemos Leta Express para Brasil, pero ya se está desarrollando una versión en español y que debe estar disponible para las primeras pruebas, yo creo que en febrero, a lo mejor final de enero. Estamos trabajando en eso y como ya tenemos la plataforma brasileña, es más fácil. Tiene guardarreios estrictos. Estamos intentando convencerla que no tome decisiones, que no haga juicios normativos. Tiene ajuste fino de parámetros, como ya demostré a ustedes, para menor variabilidad. Y tiene una cosa que es lo más importante de todo. Ninguna respuesta de inteligencia artificial se queda sin una revisión humana. Nosotros vamos a ver ahora cómo esto acontece, cómo esto pasa. Ahí está más o menos una pantalla del ETA Express. Entonces, la persona aquí hace la pregunta, ¿cierto? Este es un ejemplo. La inteligencia artificial expresa una respuesta, esa es parte de la respuesta, y esta respuesta llega a un dashboard del investigador. O sea, se queda ahí para el investigador leer y analizar, evaluar en todo eso. Bueno, la respuesta que la inteligencia artificial expresó llega simultáneamente a un dashboard del consultor humano, quien realiza los comentarios de revisión y los envía al investigador. Entonces, el consultor humano, en un plazo de 48 horas, mira esta respuesta de inteligencia artificial y puede hacer comentarios, corrigiendo, ajustando o lo que es más deseable y probable, diciendo, bueno, está todo bien, siga por este camino. ¿Cierto? Entonces aquí está. A revisión, hay un espacio para el consultor humano hacer sus observaciones. Esta observación del consultor humano llega al dashboard del investigador nuevamente. O sea, hay un ping-pong ahí, un tenis, ¿no es cierto? Y ahí el investigador tiene la posibilidad de dar su feedback. Puede decir si la respuesta fue útil, parcialmente útil o no útil, ¿no es cierto? Y ahí aún tiene aquí el espacio para hacer comentarios adicionales, si queda dudas todavía, si queda alguna duda todavía, o algo así. Y eso, de nuevo, va para el investigador, que va a ver lo que opinó, disculpa, va al consultor humano, que va a ver qué es lo que opinó el investigador y puede hacer una devolutiva, una réplica del feedback. Aquí está. Entonces, aquí está el resultado del feedback, él ve eso, y la devolución del consultor humano. Y después todo esto ya completo, ahí está completo un ciclo total de una consulta, es devolvido para el dashboard del investigador. Y se quedan todos ahí, mira, en colores distintas. Ahí está la respuesta en verde, la revisión del consultor está en naranjo, el feedback está en azul. Y acá el color está parecido, pero ya cambié eso, ahora está amarillo, pero en este momento estaba todavía rojo, disculpa, no, violeta, ¿no es cierto? Pero los colores distintos para facilitar, y eso se queda para siempre en el dashboard del investigador, si quiere consultar de nuevo, tiene ahí todo el historial de la interacción con el consultor humano. Todas las interacciones quedan registradas permanentemente en ambos dashboards. Y siempre todas las nuevas interacciones del consultor hacia el investigador se notifican por correo electrónico al investigador. Entonces, él recibe un mail diciendo, oye, tiene una interacción nueva, acceda al sistema para ver qué es, y así puede facilitar mucho cuando hay un cierto tiempo entre la respuesta de uno y de otro. Bueno, consideraciones finales, por fin. La inteligencia artificial es apoyo, no es autoridad ética de ninguna manera. No tenemos esta intención, por lo menos en este momento. La gobernanza de la inteligencia artificial es aún más importante do que la tecnología. Entonces, esta administración del sistema, y que es esencialmente humano, es más importante aún. Supervisión humana siempre necesaria, siempre. Y los principios éticos tienen que ser siempre el eje de estabilidad de una plataforma de inteligencia artificial. Bueno, para terminar, las primeras experiencias del uso con Express que yo tengo indican que la inteligencia artificial podría apoyar el fortalecimiento de los sistemas de ética, pero siempre, siempre bajo condiciones de uso responsable, calibración técnica constante y supervisión humana. Esto era, muchas gracias, y aprovecho también para desearles feliz Navidad y un excelente 2026. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Sergio. Es realmente fascinante el trabajo que vienes haciendo, no solamente reflexionando sobre el tema, sino tratando de poner en práctica el uso de las herramientas de inteligencia artificial para la revisión ética. Quiero invitar ahora a Adriel Reutemann a compartir sus reflexiones, sus impresiones. Adriel Reutemann, lo conocen ustedes, él es abogado de formación, es además de consultor del Programa Regional de Bioética de la OPS, es miembro de varios comités de ética, incluido el Comité de Ética central del Ministerio de Salud de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires, y también es el asesor legal de la dirección del Ministerio de Salud de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires, de la dirección específica que ve los temas relacionados a investigación. Y además es otra persona que está constantemente pensando sobre cómo usar la inteligencia artificial para el beneficio del fortalecimiento ético de la investigación. Gracias por estar con nosotros, Adriel, adelante.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Carla. Buenas tardes a todos. Antes que nada, quería felicitar a Sergio por el desarrollo, me pareció fascinante. Eh, no sé si habrán notado la cantidad de veces que Sergio mencionó la necesidad de supervisión humana, la cantidad de veces que refirió que esto es una herramienta preanalítica, y creo que ningún exceso es suficiente para dejarlo en claro. Cualquier intento o mensaje que deje ver o que deje entender que a través de la inteligencia artificial se puede suplir todo el procedimiento de deliberación o de análisis de cualquier proceso en general, bueno, es como mínimo un acto de irresponsabilidad, porque el estado del arte actual de la inteligencia artificial no está preparado para eso, al menos no en los niveles que nosotros usamos, ¿no? A nivel ChatGPT, a nivel Gemini, Claude o el que usen. Y es importante entender, cuando hablamos de inteligencia artificial, estamos hablando de un concepto en general. Cuando hacemos planteos sobre, bueno, los desafíos de la inteligencia artificial, es tan amplio. Recién venía viendo las preguntas que venían haciendo, y uno puede enfocarse en lo que tiene que ver con el derecho de propiedad intelectual, el plagio, la generación de imágenes, el derecho de daños, digamos, quién va a ser responsable de todos los daños que generen los modelos de lenguaje. Podemos enfocarnos en el aprendizaje profundo, en el deep learning. Hay un montón de esferas que involucran la inteligencia artificial y la realidad es que cada disciplina merece su análisis particular enfocado en su propia jerga. Acá lo que yo vengo a plantear es una pregunta que no pretendo responder y pretendo dejarlo abierto para que eventualmente lo reflexionemos juntos, pero es una reflexión que vengo teniendo hace un tiempo. En tanto me interesa los desarrollos tecnológicos porque siempre me ha gustado, mi formación de abogado, mi intervención en comités de ética en investigación. Hace un tiempo me vengo haciendo la pregunta si los comités de ética en investigación tradicionales, los que están constituidos actualmente, están preparados para hacer evaluaciones, monitoreos, supervisiones de investigaciones que usen inteligencia artificial en su totalidad o en algún tramo del proceso. Y en realidad la pregunta tiene que ver también sobre, bueno, ¿cómo aplicamos los principios de la bioética a este nuevo paradigma? Porque en verdad hablamos de un nuevo paradigma. Nosotros tenemos un marco tradicional que está diseñado está muy centrado en la intervención directa en el individuo, y a partir del desarrollo del Big Data y la inteligencia artificial, ha cambiado tanto el paradigma que ha abierto una brecha. Tenemos investigaciones que son cada vez más de tipo exploratorio, que reutilizan datos secundarios que inicialmente no fueron obtenidos para investigación, que afectan a grupos masivos de población que merecen protección y tal vez no tanto a un individuo en particular. Entonces, desde esa ética principalista, eh, empiezo a observar como una reflexión propia que tal vez estos cimientos sobre los que se constituye la bioética médica actual entran en tensión. Por supuesto, son principios que son de aplicación y que van a seguir siendo de aplicación, pero que como mínimo entran en tensión respecto de algunos aspectos que nos trae el uso de inteligencia artificial para la investigación, porque así como los comités se empiezan a nutrir de herramientas para las evaluaciones, como bien ha mostrado Sergio, también lo hacen los investigadores. Y mucho más allá de modelos de generación de generación de texto o modelos de lenguaje. Ya hablamos de la utilización de modelos de aprendizaje profundo para el procesamiento de los datos que después van a ser las conclusiones de una investigación. Entonces, partiendo de la base de que no siempre conocemos cómo es que funciona esa caja negra de procesamiento, digamos, es lo que se suele conocer como la opacidad de los sistemas de inteligencia artificial. Si el propio investigador en cierto punto no conoce de qué manera se procesa esa información, ¿cómo va a ser el comité de ética de la investigación para evaluar si funciona desde el punto de vista ético y metodológico esa investigación? Yo hablaba de los principios, tal vez, bueno, uno hablando de los principios, lo primero que nos viene a la cabeza, bueno, es cómo los comités hacen evaluaciones respecto a la autonomía, cómo focalizan en los consentimientos informados, en lo que tienen, lo que no tienen, cómo lo dicen, lo que falta, la extensión. Y sin embargo, hay muchos procesos nuevos que escapan a la lógica tradicional del consentimiento informado individual, en tanto la autonomía de una persona. Pensemos, por ejemplo, no sé, el caso de una universidad que pide una evaluación ética para hacer un estudio sobre 60 millones de registros de los últimos 10 años de registros electrónicos para ver la prevalencia o la posibilidad de que determinado grupo poblacional desarrolle más la diabetes, por decir un ejemplo cualquiera. En principio, el Comité de Ética de Investigación lo va a evaluar, no va a pedir consentimiento informado a 60 millones de personas, es un estudio retrospectivo, en principio encuadraría dentro de las reglas de la dispensa. Pero ¿qué pasa después con esos resultados? Esa universidad podría convertirse en una startup a partir de esas conclusiones. Esa información puede ser cedida, transferida a compañías de seguro, a otro tipo de entidades, no sé, para tomar decisiones y cobrar más caro una póliza, para, no sé, condicionar el acceso a trabajos de determinados grupos de gente. A lo que voy es que la lógica del comité evaluando ese estudio con ese paciente en particular o con ese individuo en particular y que culmina con el cierre del estudio, parece quedar un poco limitada con este nuevo esquema. Lo mismo respecto al principio de beneficencia y no maleficencia. Estamos muy acostumbrados a hacer la evaluación riesgo-beneficio en base a un individuo, a un sujeto de investigación. Y la realidad es que hoy por hoy tendríamos que hablar ya de un sujeto de datos, por lo menos cuando se emplean grandes volúmenes de información respecto a las personas. Y digo que entra en tensión porque si no conocemos del todo cuáles son los riesgos previsibles, posibles de un proceso de investigación y tampoco los beneficios, digámoslo todo, es difícil hacer ese análisis de riesgo-beneficio. Cuando yo lo he planteado con alguien, me han dicho, con razón también, que tal vez el problema no son los principios, el problema es, bueno, tratar de identificar bien cuál es el riesgo que entrañan estos procesos y nos seguimos enmarcando dentro del principio, no está fallando el principio en sí. Y puede ser que sea así, pero la realidad es que si en cierto punto no conocemos del todo los riesgos, y no vamos a poder conocerlos a ciencia cierta, y no vamos a poder conocer a ciencia cierta los beneficios, bueno, un poco empieza a perder sentido y empieza a resquebrajarse ese principio por futilidad, por no poder tener las variables necesarias para hacer esa comparación y esa ecuación. Después, desde el punto de vista de la justicia y la equidad, estos modelos de inteligencia artificial es sabido que replican, intensifican y magnifican los sesgos que ya traemos de base, y es algo que en particular los comités tienen que prestar mucha atención para evitar patrones de discriminación, segregación o algún tipo de práctica como esa. Entonces, a ver, para no quitar más tiempo y dar lugar a los demás, la pregunta es si, por cómo están compuestos los comités actualmente, en los que, bueno, sabemos que tiene que haber en general un metodólogo, un miembro de la comunidad, un abogado, por Dios que siempre haya un abogado y que siempre tengamos un lugar ahí, pero tal vez es momento de pensar en otros perfiles, también de estos de corte obligatorio o de corte necesario.
That would be necessary to find in a research ethics committee, somebody who's on data science, technology, technological development, because it seems to me that if we're talking about traditional protocols, at a certain point, we are increasingly including practices related to artificial intelligence, but in some point of the process is being impacted by this. And the committee, in some cases, they already have shortcomings, which may be structural because we know there's a lack of resources, and lack of trained personnel and support. So sometimes this could be just one more shortcoming, which might require a different kind of profile. So finally, these changes require a governance framework for the ethics of AI, starting with the design, thinking about ethics in publications and in the sponsors and ultimate use. And so the committee needs to be aware of this, and there are a lot of harms that are also hard to predict. And sometimes you devote a lot of time to this, and it would be good to have a global governance system that could address these consequences and take information for subsequent decisions. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. Thank you very much, Adriel. I'm now pleased to give the floor to Leonel Gresh, is the vice president of PAHO, which is the Ethics Committee for Research on Human Subjects at PAHO, and he's also an international consultant at PAHO, WHO, who specializes in response to health emergencies, and he's also worked throughout the region encouraging research and encouraging this research to be done ethically in various countries. You have the floor, Leonel. It is a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you, Carla, and a very good morning or good afternoon to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and I would like to congratulate Sergio for his excellent presentation, which opens the door to our conversation today. I'd like to go back to an initial point, why we need artificial intelligence, and from the perspective of a member of an ethics review committee, we do see this not just a matter of what's in style, but also because we know that the ethics review committees have a very heavy workload. And people often have many other responsibilities in their various institutions, and just do the ethics review as an additional task. So if we fail to use instruments that might ultimately enhance their ability to conduct ethics review, might leave us to do something unethical. So we need to do everything possible to be able to quickly respond and give a good quality response to investigators that are seeking ethics approval. So I would like to start with three considerations, somewhat general ones regarding AI, and perhaps the goes a little bit beyond today's specific topic of the use of artificial intelligence in research ethics reviews. And also it touches on something that Sergio mentioned, and one is that of biases. We need to be very clear, as Sergio said, that this is not an objective tool. It is not a completely objective tool. It can be more objective than us as human beings, but there are biases that come from the information that is fed into these AI models.
And it could be that the different viewpoints from the different categories of professionals or the different social groups might not be represented similarly in those artificial intelligence algorithms. So it could lead or maybe reinforce certain inequities or discriminations. And one could think of things, for example, of research, something that we've been working with in PAHO, with pregnant women, for example, or the AI that takes the information that exists today and could say, well, there's not enough research of pregnant women. Maybe that's okay, and maybe we should continue. And then maybe set a lot of restrictions for pregnant women when we know that today that's not the case, that the barriers that were set to that type of research have led to a low number of medical interventions or activities for pregnant women and things that could benefit their health. So we have those biases. We have the question that I think is essential and Sergio mentioned of the actual evaluation and how we evaluate those AI tools. And in CHAP today, we use a lot of tools in different topics that are not evaluated. So how can we ensure that the artificial intelligence is being done correctly? Or how can we define criteria in other quality fields to ensure that the artificial intelligence is actually giving us the response we expect, or at least that the probability of that the response that is given is quality and the best. And of course, these processes lead to all kinds of things that exist in our everyday life, in our professional or everyday life. But so we do need those mechanisms that could be internal and external, of course, to ensure the quality of these tools. Sergio, in fact, referred to the hallucinations. And there are several studies showing that some of the tools have rate of bibliography references that don't exist, that are simple results of hallucinations that could be, I don't know, 10 to up to 40% of the references included in result of AI. And I think that the third thing I wanted to mention, though I'm not going to go into too many details, is the environmental impact, which is a problem that concerns us worldwide. The UN Organization for the Environment has highlighted the fact that it consumes a large amount of metal because of all the programs related to extraction and recycling. as well as amount of electricity and water. And I can say that by 2027, it is estimated that the water consumption related to the use of artificial intelligence could be 4 to 6 times the actual consumption of a country of 7 million inhabitants, like Paraguay, for example. So I think that these are considerations that have to be taken into account when using artificial intelligence. So from the point of view of what we could do as users, as members of an ethics committee, I think that it's also important that we define, and Sergio's example I felt was excellent. It's important to define what concrete actions or tasks can we ask from artificial intelligence so that they can support our work in the ethics committee, in the review process. And there, it's important to know what are we asking for and how we're asking it. And we know that all these models are very sensitive to the way in which we ask the questions. Sergio also mentioned the advantages of having specific tools of the process. And I think that in that aspect, participation of researchers as well as of the members of the ethics committees is essential, not only to evaluate, but to develop or support in the development of these AI tools. And I can imagine several tasks that would seem maybe very simple, but could be very complex and take up a lot of time in our everyday work in a committee, that tasks that could be helped by artificial intelligence without a fact. In fact, the initial screening of the proposals, we could think of systems that would help us review the inclusion and exclusion criteria, review the consistency of the protocols and the informed consent forms. Often in our work, we find that there are inconsistencies in the protocol or between the protocol and the actual informed consent documents, and these tools could definitely help us identify these inconsistencies much quicker, sorry. And they could also help to see if the design of the studies actually responds to the research question that is being asked. They could also help in checking the sizes of the samples and identifying the type of sensitive information is being compiled and whether, or so that the committee can later review how the information is being handled to limit possible risks that could be linked to the dissemination of the information. I think that consistency of protocols with the legislations or the recommendations or the national or international standards is important. As Sergio mentioned, it's also a challenge because it means having tools capable of analyzing the legislations or standards of the different countries to adapt to the local context. And I even think that they could be tools that could help us identify once the protocol is in process. As we know, the ethical review process is a continuous process to see whether there's information that's new that could have an impact on the protocols that are already in process and that could also be relevant for the researchers as well as for the ethics committees to actually carry out that continuous evaluation process and the ethics evaluation of the protocols that are being used. So I think that there are challenges, there are limitations that have already been mentioned today, but I also believe that these are tools that could be an important aid to improve the work of the ethics committees as well as to make the work of the researchers easier, as Sergio showed in the development phase of the protocols. It's also a stage where these AI tools could be very helpful. And I think that I'll end by saying that this stage that we're carrying out this now is very important as a research community or as an ethics review committee community. We should get more involved in the development and evaluation of these artificial intelligence tools that could be useful for the work that we're going to be doing in the future. And Carla, with this, I return the floor back to you.
Un millón de gracias.
Thank
And
you
I'm gonna
so
switch
much.
to English now. So I'm happy to introduce to you Cheryl Cox McPherson, who's a professor at St. George's University in Grenada. And she's been teaching bioethics for many years, decades, I would say. And she has been leading a Fogarty-funded research ethics training program in the Caribbean for many years as well. Thank you, Cheryl, for being with us. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Carla. And congratulations to Sergio for really laying out some of the issues so clearly and kicking this off. I want to just say a little bit more about two things that have been mentioned already by the panelists. Sergio made the important point toward the end about human supervision and how important that is, that we can't have AI without that. And probably all of us would agree with that. But the reality is that AI developers and the world of AI experts in general, not just us looking at health or research ethics or research even, are concerned about AI's ability, its capacity to do things itself, to do things we don't want it to do, to create potential threats to health and to life itself. So my first thought is that we have to be much more cautious than we are or have been in how we use it, when we use it, why we use it. Because we don't know what it's going to do. And we've heard some of the things that it can do that are not helpful. And there are many others that are unknown. And there have been calls before for some sort of global governance. The state of the world is such that it's going to be very difficult to find willingness to create such a framework. It's a challenge. I would love to see it happen, and I can't emphasize enough how important I think that is. And my limited knowledge about AI and its development is that those who are leading the way in it share that concern. I think it's the commercial interests and the popular interests that have taken us down this line of adopting it. It's not going to go away. It's embedded in all of our lives already in our personal and professional work, and we have to deal with that. But it's not necessarily going to be helpful in the long run. So I wanted to make that point. And I also wanted to come back to this idea of the environmental impacts. So in addition to the water use, data centers that we need for AI use electricity. And the evidence suggests that in 2022, they used as much electricity to make them all over the world the 11th largest electricity consumer globally, just the data centers alone. And that by next year, 2026, they're projected to bump up to be 5th in the world in terms of global electricity consumers. So environmentally, it's a problem. In terms of the land use, these things are huge swaths of land that are just obliterated natural environments and other environments to put built environments that are huge energy and water consumers there. Now, none of us can individually make a lot of difference about that. Does it mean we shouldn't use AI? I'm not going so far as to suggest that, but we should be thinking about, if we're concerned about ethics, we should be thinking about the trade-offs that are being made when we use it. So while I agree that we can't get away from it, and while I agree that we need to have some sort of a regulatory ethical framework and governance that's coherent and has the teeth in it to actually make a difference, I'm not confident that we're there yet, or that we're even going to get there, unfortunately. So my point is simply that when we use AI, we need to be cautious. We need to be more cautious. We need to be aware of the harms and think a little bit more about the trade-offs involved in advancing it. I don't have an answer, but we need to think more about this. Thank you, Carla, and back to you.
Thank you, Cheryl. I want to invite now. Oh, hold on. I have to switch to Spanish now. Ahora quiero invitar a Andrés.
And now I would like to invite Andrés Perry, who's here from the Public Health Ministry of Chile, where he's in charge of the unit or division or direction responsible for research and responsible for accrediting and supervising research ethics committees. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Andres, and we'd like to hear you share your thoughts from this angle that has additional complexities. And thank you for being with us today, Andres. Thank you. And my greetings from the Bioethics Office in Chile, and my gratitude to PAHO for the invitation, as well as for the presentations that we heard, which were quite inspiring and full of challenges. I would like to propose some ideas. First, highlighting that talking about all these possibilities that Sergio mentioned of the pre-analytical support, as well as the regulatory contamination, I think it's very important for us to speak of the responsibilities of national regulatory authorities with the active, clear, and use of the standards and the local ethics reflections, and the universities and the study centers, because these are the databases that are going to feed the artificial intelligence that would then do the ethical evaluations or will support at the time of the research. So there is a responsibility of the authorities when updating the information, when advertising it, and with the relative ethical literature. And this is to avoid that regulatory contamination, which I think is so important. And on the other hand, I believe that the words Cheryl mentioned regarding the limits that we don't know of artificial intelligence were quite inspiring. Contrary to technology like the calculator or the internet, the truth that these are all technologies that have come to an end with well-known limits, I should say. But artificial intelligence, it opens a limitless possibility. We have the generative, we have the predictive, and eventually the unknown. So I take up what Cheryl said about establishing some type of regulatory framework, and I think that here the concept of governance or anticipatory governance would be important, with flexibility, with the ability to make agile normative changes, not so much. It has to be ordered, interactive, collaborative, in deliberative spaces within the actual institution of the ethical development for research. And the other thing I think has to do with the question of human supervision. clear, it's necessary, but it has to be supervision that has to be trained and capable. What is the responsibility then of ethics committees when training in artificial intelligence? And how do we work with engineering and technology in the very context of the committee itself? And that's important because those of us who work in bioethics would like to be in the design process of the research itself, but it would seem as though the engineers got ahead of us, and technology has to be involved in the design and in the ethics committees as well. So, as Ariel spoke of the research principles, and I think that there's tension also in the scientific methods and what participation does AI have in all types of research and all types of methodologies. And if we speak of methodology and ethics, good research has a social value and a scientific rigor. And we have to mention the opportunities that the ethics committees have when evaluating projects. We'd have to remember that artificial intelligence is a window of opportunity for the vulnerable groups because of the language barriers or the capacity, but we can't just forget that artificial intelligence has no cultural relevance or actual accreditation in simple and easy reading for disabilities, and it has no validation from the point of view of experience. So it could be tempting for our researchers to leave the informed consent on the artificial intelligence, but as a committee, it would also be easy for us to depend on the artificial intelligence at that level as well. But I think that the human participation is very important in the informed consent process. And then there's another question that comes up in my mind when we think of qualitative methodologies. How do we add safeguard criteria of the methodologic rigorous nature? How does the committee consider the inaccuracy of the models and the biosafety and the hallucinations of the AI that Sergio mentioned and the biases that Lionel mentioned? So the committee's role is becoming almost stronger now and has to begin to identify what are the mechanisms we actually have to evaluate the methodologic rigor with actual repercussions on ethics and the ethics evaluation. I think that the iteration and the intelligence being evaluated and reevaluated and triangulated maybe with other technology or other members, the reflexive feedback, the concern of participants, all are aspects that could be key for us who don't work with artificial intelligence directly, but we know a little about the methodology, could use to evaluate these methodologies. And lastly, I don't want to neglect the concern expressed by Cheryl and Lionel about the environmental impact. And I wonder whether it's a responsibility of the Ethics Committee or of the standards authorities to establish criteria for reduction of the AI, technical criteria. When Sergio speaks of temperature, for example, when he speaks of the different technical criteria required by AI to reduce the defects, what are the responsibilities of the ethics committees in this case and the environmental impact? Can an ethics committee determine that a research doesn't need the AI? Can a committee determine that actually it doesn't need 3 iterations for one specific software? What criteria can we add so as to reduce or maybe minimize or make a fair use and accurate of the artificial intelligence in research and also in ethics evaluation as well, I guess. That's all, Carlos. Those are the thoughts that come to mind as a result of the presentations. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Andrés. And now I've made note of the name. I always get confused with the names of the different directions, units, and offices in the region, the Bioethics Office and of the Ministry of Health of Chile. And that's where Andrés comes from. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sara Carraceda from the Bioethics Regional Program in PAHO, who's going to chair the next session of the discussions. There are several panelists, and I'd like to invite you all back, and I'd like to give the floor to Sara. Sergio, thank you. All of you, turn your microphones, your cameras on. Andres, Cheryl, can you turn your camera on? Sergio, all of you. Very well. Thank you all very much. Sergio, thank you for your presentation, and thank you all for the comments. I believe this has been one of the sessions where we've received the largest number of questions and the ones I've had the hardest time organizing. I think that there are several things here. Maybe we could begin by the general questions and some technical aspects which are always useful to analyze the ethical implications that we're talking about here today. The first question is whether you believe that for transparency reasons, one should know publicly what prompts have been used to request responses in the process of an ethics review. I don't know who would like to answer. This is a conversation. I can answer if you want. I'll start. I think it would be interesting. In fact, it would be good practice in some processes when you publish some to explain the prompt and the system used. But I don't know how much information that's going to give us actually, because the language models behind are changing their composition of the algorithm continuously, and the prompt itself replicated in the same model can actually give different responses. So it could help in the transparency to try to understand somehow how we got to that result, but I don't think that's going to completely explain how we got to that result. Thank you, Adriel. Anyone who would like to add something to what Adriel said? Sergio, would you like to add something? No, I think Adriel has said it all. I think it's really very difficult to do that. But yeah, it would be desirable, without a doubt. Thank you. So, since we're on this topic of transparency, there are some comments on the chat about sharing the research protocols in open platforms, open sites that use AI, like ChatGPT. Should we do that? Should we not? What are the implications doing this would have? Anyone? Well, maybe I can make a comment, Sarah. Maybe not directly on thinking, for example, of an example like the one Sergio gave of a specific tool that's being developed specifically for support of the research work, who are going to send their document to the ethics committee or to support the work of the ethics committees as such. I think that, yes, it might be useful for those tools to be fed by ethics committee decisions and protocols, be they positive or negative, so that one can actually try to replicate or even improve the performance of committees in their ethics review. So in that context, I think that it might be interesting, because in a controlled context, protocols, of course, with the authorization of the researchers and with the necessary mechanisms that one would have to implement for this to be possible, but the decisions of the committees and the protocols could then be used to feed those tools that we would be trying to develop. Thank you. May I say something? Yes, sure. I just wanted to add something to what Leonel said.
En mi opinión,
I think
es casi imposible se
it's almost
pensar en una
impossible
herramienta
to think
de
of
apoyo en
a
ética y de investigación que no sea
support
específica,
tool in
que
research,
sea general.
in ethics
Y lo que se
research that
usa
is
es lo
general.
general, porque claro, es
And what we
gratis, es
use is
accesible,
general
la
because
persona,
it's
como dijo,
free, it's accessible,
puede
and
pedir
as we said,
los
the person
partidos de
can
su equipo
ask for the
y a la vez
team's results, for
hacerlo,
example,
por ejemplo.
as well as
Entonces,
the use of a placebo if you
pero
want. I
el
mean,
riesgo de esto
but
es grande.
the
Yo lo
risk
tengo
is
probado, eso
enormous.
tengo
I've
hecho
tested this.
consultas
I've asked
para una y otra
for
plataforma
different
y la
platforms,
diferencia es
and the
gigante,
differences are
porque como
enormous.
dijo Lionel,
Because, as Lionel
una
said,
ventaja de la
the advantage
inteligencia artificial
of
que ha sido
artificial
entrenada para ética
intelligence
en pesquisa, que ha
that's
sido,
been
aunque
trained
no
for
sea
research
una
in
propia,
ethics,
es
even
que
if it's not its own,
puede
is that one
exprimirla y
can
puede dar
teach it,
límites
one can
y
set
puede
limits, and one
revisarla
can
a todo rato
review it
y
at all
corregirla y
levels
hacer
and
mejor.
correct it, which is what's most
Entonces,
important.
creo que es esencial. Eso nos, claro que
I
la
think that would be
inteligencia
essential. But of course,
general, esa,
general
esa que
intelligence,
nosotros
the
usamos
one
a
that we
diario,
use all the
sí,
time,
aprende con
learns
las interacciones que hace con
with
eso,
the
pero
iterations,
no es lo
but
mismo,
it's not the
no es lo
same.
mismo. Yo
It's
creo
really
que
not the
es muy
same. I
peligroso
think that it would be very dangerous, in fact,
confiar demasiado
to
en
trust
la inteligencia
excessively
artificial
in
que
artificial
no es
intelligence that
específica.
is not
Pero eso
specific.
en mi experiencia,
But
claro, porque antes no
that's my
tenía eso.
experience now. I
So,
didn't realize
yo
that
creo que
before.
todos nosotros
And in
ya
fact, now
usamos eso y a
all of
veces
us
nos
use this
confiamos. Pero
and
porque
sometimes
nosotros somos
believe in it,
expertos,
but
entonces el riesgo es
we're
mucho. Pero
experts, so
como dijo en
the
mi
risk with
presentación,
us is less.
si eso
But as I
cae en
said in my
manos de una
presentation, if this
persona
falls
que
in
no
the hands
tiene
of someone
experiencia,
who
eso puede
doesn't
ser
have
un
experience,
desastre
it could be a
muy
disaster
peligroso realmente.
and very dangerous.
Gracias. Sí, Andrés.
Thank you. Yes, Andrés. I just want to say that in addition to the merit, sharing the protocol also allows you to justify decisions. The use of one kind of AI over another obliges you to say why you selected this one. And that is important to share with the unit and for the ethics committee. So I think that's another good reason to share the
Gracias,
protocol.
Andrés.
Thank you,
Ahora,
Andrés.
Sergio, que mencionabas
Now,
esto de la
Sergio,
IA específica,
you
hay varias
mentioned
preguntas sobre
specific
esto.
AI. We have several questions on
El
that.
hecho de que estos
The
conocimientos que
fact
sean
that
más
this
específicos, que sea todo
knowledge
más
that are more
limitado,
specific
digamos,
and
no es en perjuicio
more
de las
limited
respuestas que
does
podría
not
dar esta
prejudice the
herramienta. Eso por un
responses
lado.
that the
Y lo
tool could
segundo
provide.
es
That's one question.
en el tema
Second
de los
one
revisores.
is
Lionel
as
mencionaba estos
regards the
sesgos
reviewers.
que existen al
Leonel
utilizar la
mentioned the
inteligencia artificial,
biases
pero
that
había
exist
una
when you
pregunta
use
que
AI,
se
but there was a
refería a los
question
sesgos de los
that
revisores para
referred to the
alimentar
biases
esta
of the
herramienta de
reviewers
inteligencia
who
artificial.
feed
¿Me dejo
the
entender?
AI
¿Sí?
tool. Did I
Sí,
make myself clear? Yes.
respecto a los sesgos de los revisores,
Okay,
yo creo que eso pasa
as
también
regards
en
the
niveles que no
biases
son
of the
inteligencia
reviewers,
artificiales.
that always happens whether or
Hay que
not you're
tener
using
un estándar,
AI.
tener
You
también
have to have a
personas que trabajan
standard
con eso.
and you have to use people
La
who work with
responsabilidad es la
that.
misma.
The
La diferencia es
responsibility
que
is the
ellos van a
same. The
revisar la
difference is
respuesta
that
de
they are
inteligencia
going to
artificial para ver
review
si allí no
an
hay
AI
sesgos.
response to make
Creo
sure
que lo
there
más
isn't any
importante es
bias
eso.
there. I think
No sé,
that's
la
the most
primera no
important thing.
recuerdo.
I don't recall what the first question was, Sarah. Could
Sí,
you repeat
que al
it?
ser una inteligencia
Yes.
artificial específica,
When you use
digamos, está
specific
nutrida de
AI,
información más
it's
limitada y
been
si eso
fed with
podría,
more limited
digamos, afectar la
information,
calidad
and
de
might
las
that
respuestas, ¿no?
impact the quality of
Afecta
the
para mejor.
responses? It
No tengo
affects that
dudas.
for the better.
Afecta para
There's no
mejor.
doubt about it.
Mejora
It has a positive impact. It
Eh,
improves these responses.
Si uno pregunta a
If
el
you
Express, por
ask
ejemplo, yo he hecho
at the Express,
muchas
for
pruebas,
example, I've done many tests on
preguntar
this,
tonteras, así como cosas
asking dumb things, silly
completamente
things,
raras y fuera de
uh,
contexto,
things totally
y la
out of
inteligencia
context.
artificial específica
And
me
the
contesta
specific
después.
AI
No
answers
entendí tu
saying,
pregunta,
I
o
did not
entonces me
understand
dice,
your
oye,
question,
eso
or
no
else
está
it
en el
tells me
contexto de
that is
ética y de
not within the
investigación, yo no puedo
context of
contestar,
research ethics and I
también me dice
cannot
que vas a
answer. I
reprobar.
recommend that you go somewhere
Bueno,
else.
eso es la gracia. Claro que
That is a good thing.
son cosas infinitas que tiene que
So
estar
there are an
arreglando una
infinite
gobernanza
number of
muy,
things
muy,
that you
muy
have to
fuerte
keep correcting with
que no
very,
son
very strong
sencillas
governance,
ni
which is
rápidas,
not
pero se va
straightforward, nor is it
mejorando a
quick,
cada rato.
but it keeps
Como
getting
dijo, yo no,
improved. As I said, I do not intend to propose something here that replaces ethics reviews or limits the activities of the investigator. These are points that are raised so that we can get the people who are being asked to reflect on this. That's the idea, in order to improve their proposals. So it can be useful. We must bear in mind its limitations. This is not a panacea or something that fixes everything. Rather, it's one more tool that may resolve some specific problems that we have in the ethics review community. And just to finish that, we shouldn't be expecting that it will be a brilliant thing that's going to draft the complete protocol or answer all of your questions with the final answer, but it will help you out somewhat. Nothing more than that. And perhaps as it evolves over time, and also with the ethics community involved, and I agree on the environmental concerns, all of this may change over time. For the time being, we have this. Thank you, Sergio. Are there any other comments? Perhaps I could say something about the use of specific AI. And once again, I am not a specialist in AI. No, but I do see that the field is evolving. While it's true that there are tools for the general public's use, and this is for professionals, we have increasingly more specific tools. And when you still look at the limitations of some of these specific tools, for example, for scientific work, which use bibliographical references that don't even exist, we see that we are in the process of cleaning things up. The idea of having something specific, at least with the technology that we have today, I think is really the right approach. As regards biases, you perhaps, and maybe that's an optimistic viewpoint, but the use of AI might make it possible for us to have a less biased evaluation if we also have systems that have been trained. They could have less bias than we have as individuals, but perhaps that's too optimistic of a view. Thank you, Cesara. Thank you, Leonel. There are several questions that refer to plagiarism and the behavior and intellectual property rights, and other general ones about regulation of AI in general. If you had to just say a couple of key points that these regulations should contain, AI regulations, what would you say it have? In principle, I think this is something that we all agree needs to be regulated. I think maybe Adriel should answer that question, says Sergio. Well, that's what I was thinking, says Adriel. If you'd like, I have a few comments. Aside from the legal aspects, it's interesting to think of how these AI results are constructed. You might say, well, it is plagiarism because somebody uploaded a document and the AI was fed by that document to create new content. But what in fact it's doing is a cognitive process like any human being does, but it's to the higher power. But everything that we do and create is based on previous influences. So what comes out of AI is part of a process of assimilation, but it is magnified. What does happen, and I connect this to one of the first questions we heard, how do we handle the confidentiality of some documents? We're working with a system of ethics review, and all of this has confidentiality restrictions all over the place. So we have to model this through an API because you give it specific instructions, but at the end of the road, it also dips into different wells such as ChatGPT, Gemini, and others. So it does wind up sharing some of all that. So generally speaking, although it's a major effort, what the systems have to do is to look at this before they send it in. Locally, they need to extract all of the sensitive information, and what gets sent to be processed by the algorithm would be the document with other data or different data, or completely launder out the data. And they have to see when is it aseptic and when is it aseptic. And in principle, this would be a way to protect the information contained in the documents. As regards plagiarism and other issues, there are international precedents in this, and we have to look at very minuscule review of various authors, either through OpenAI, but that is something that's there, as well as a civil responsibility for compensation if there is any abuse of AI. All of this has to be built and destroyed. And there are many things that come about. So we need to be very aware of the confidentiality of information. Thank you, Adriel. Sergio
Can I add
says,
to
I'd like
that,
to complement that, and
Cheryl?
Cheryl is speaking.
Sorry, Cheryl.
Yeah, I just go
Okay,
ahead.
let's go with you, and then we'll go with Sergio. I'm sorry, Sergio.
Oh, sorry, Sergio.
No, it's okay.
No, I was just going to add that, and I don't know how well this will translate these concepts into Spanish, but there's certain work been written in English about the research enterprise, the research ecosystem, and the ethics ecosystem. And this idea that research ethics, we're just a small part of the bigger research realm. And so Adriel's comments have got me thinking about that, the importance of the researchers and funders need to understand too about the process of research ethics review as it transitions to these AI systems, because of exactly those kinds of faults. And that any sort of framework, guidance, governance, et cetera, really needs to be participatory of all of those participants in those ecosystems or enterprises. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Cheryl. Sergio, podemos ir
Yo
a ti.
quería complementar un poco lo que ha dicho
Sergio, yes, I'd
Adriel.
like to complement what Adriel had said. For example, with EthExpress, we have a bunch of disclaimers that say how you make ethical use of the platform. And one of these, in terms of security, is that it is not necessary to have identifiable data. For example, what is the company? The questions are conceptual. There is no need to include identifiable data, which might even compromise patents rather, or the confidentiality about products in development. So there is a legal notice amongst many. There are many, but there is one legal notice with that expressly mentions that. It's not 100% avoidable, because all of this depends on what gets input there. And once it is input, then there are other security barriers, but they are not 100% foolproof, because there is no 100% security on the internet. That's not possible. But we do need to be careful, primarily with notices. In NetExpress, there is a manual and a script, users guideline for the use of the tool. And it includes security issues, etc. So you do have to be careful. If you want to use this, you have to take some precautions, some that we're all familiar with that have been very well expressed by the panelists here, but there are others that we can't even foresee, which are hard to predict and are going to appear over time. So we always need to pay attention to this. Governance is the key word. There is no way to do something like this without having very strict human governance. Otherwise, all of the doom forecasting that's been done could come to pass, and it would be very dangerous. Andres wants to add something. I want to go back to the question about the prompts. Sometimes you want to be sure that the investigator is aware that their investigation could be reproduced when it's evaluated. Oh, I'm under, as you might say, there's a concern about plagiarism, and you need to look at this. So in the end of the day, the point gets back to what Sergio said. This is a temporary limitation of AI because probably in a short time, they'll be able to sort all of this out. So the major problem here has to do with the governance and how we have flexible regulatory framework, because any barriers that or guardrails that we might put on AI, the AI itself will probably offer a solution. So it's very complex to think of the mechanisms that might prevent this. Sergio speaking. Yes, Andres. That's the difference with specific AI, because it's easier to have those limits or guardrails that I talked about in my presentation with specific AI, because although there is already a preset structure of AI, it's like a blank sheet of paper on which you could put the limits and adjust things. Obviously, the ideal thing would be if you have AI produced by your own institution, then it can be completely controlled. So these are things that can be controlled, but there's always the possibility that undesired things happen. So we need to always be careful with the governance. And I will say it a million times, governance and supervision are strictly necessary. We cannot think of using AI for ethics without that.
Gracias, Sergio.
Thank you, says Sarah.
Un par de preguntas más.
Perhaps just a couple more questions.
Andrés y Adriel mencionaron en su
Andrés
reflexión,
and Adriel,
digamos,
in their remarks,
esta capacidad que deberían tener los comités de ética de
mentioned the
investigación al
capacity
momento
that
de
research ethics
revisar
committees should
investigaciones que
have
utilizan
when they
inteligencia artificial.
review research projects
¿Qué
that use
podemos hacer para
AI.
fortalecer
What can we
esta
do to
capacidad,
strengthen
considerando que el
their
nivel
capacity to do this,
de los comités de
considering
experiencia es
that
bastante
the experience
diferente,
of the
que
different
la
committees may be
supervisión que se
quite
hace a los
different,
comités
and the
también se
supervision
por las
of these
autoridades
committees,
nacionales
that is to say
es
supervision
diferente
by
aún.
national health authorities,
¿Cómo podríamos
also has
empezar a ir fortaleciendo a los comités de
variability.
ética de la
So how
investigación
can we
para que
strengthen
empiecen
research
a
ethics committees so that they can
revisar
begin to feel
protocolos que
qualified
utilizan inteligencia artificial
to review protocols that
en
use
adelante?
AI moving forward? Sergio, I think that this is happening all the time because researchers are using AI to prepare their proposals. This is unavoidable. And of course, there are tools that say, well, I'm going to have use the standard language of AI, but how can you prove this? It's a lot harder to prove. So this is more or less a discussion that happens amongst professors regarding what their students do with AI to prepare papers. And that is not accepted. But this is part of the reality that we cannot ignore. And the protocol must be evaluated, either whether it's drafted by a person or by AI. I think it's very difficult for ethics committees. First of all, they might feel that this was prepared by AI. They might be concerned about that. But on the other hand, how can they draw a distinction? A proposal is a proposal. They have to evaluate the proposal. If people have different views on this, I'd like to hear them. Adriel, I think that a space like this is really part of the solution, shining light on this and the shortcomings that we all have regarding this issue. And we all have to forge this path together. And I think that this needs to have governance from governments, and also there should be training for these ethics review committees. And we need to have in these ethics committees somebody who is in these disciplines, in programming or database management or something. In addition to having physicians and community members, I think we need to include these kind of technical experts. Of course, you could hire external consultants, but somebody on the ethics committee needs to always be present to understand that aspect of the protocol would be very useful. Andres, just to respond to the two previous comments, one is to have an international, governance structure would be good on a regional level. The ethics committee interprets itself when it looks at a research project that it needs to evaluate when it doesn't understand it. Hopefully that would encourage them to get some training on their own. But I think that subsequent policies to require in-service training would come later, because there is going to be a learning curve in which perhaps responsibility does not fall to the committees, but rather the national legal framework will require this. And so we would hope that the mistakes that a committee might make wouldn't have serious repercussions. And this should be part of the national rules.
Gracias, Andrés.
Thank you, Andrés.
Creo que para cerrar y antes de pasarle la palabra a
So
Carla,
before we
mucho
close
se ha
here
mencionado a lo
and
largo de
give
esta
the floor back to
sesión,
Carla, a lot has been mentioned throughout this session about human supervision, that AI does not replace the review role played by an ethics review committee, and also normative criteria is something that each of us have as individuals and does not belong to AI, and governance. So for this reason, Sergio, I'd like to give you a couple of minutes to share some last words to reinforce all of those very important messages for the research ethics review committees and for the investigators before we hear the final words from Carla. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. What I can tell you is what I said during my main presentation. I hope it was clear, but I'll just reinforce this now. By no means does AI replace the role of human reviewers. And that is not our proposal. Sometimes it just makes the work which seeks to provide order to things and encourage people to find things that require reflection. By no means are we proposing something that would substitute the investigator, him or herself, or the ethics review committee. That is not the proposal. We should all be very clear on this. Artificial intelligence has its limitations, and these limitations could lead to significant, serious mistakes. We must bear this in mind when we propose a certain platform or the use of artificial intelligence on issues related to research ethics, but also regarding medicine in general and even beyond medicine. For other things, I concluded my presentation, if you might remember, with one very clear phrase. All of this is very good and possible as long as it is developed with great responsibility. That's true for life. With all of the tools that we have, you can have an X or Y use of it. A vehicle, a car to take your family on vacation, listening to music is the same automobile that could kill people if you're driving too fast or if you're under the influence of alcohol. I'm using another Chilean slang word for my Chilean friend there. And I have a little bit of Chilean portuñol here. So that is there. All of these tools need to be used responsibly, but we cannot ignore this tool. And I thank you, Sarah, and I thank everyone.
Carla, adelante.
You have the floor, Carla.
Muchísimas gracias a todos. Creo que
Thank you very much, everyone. I think that this has been a very rich and productive session, and hopefully, probably not the last one we will have on this topic. I've noticed a few central issues that I wanted to highlight as we close the session. And several of these have already been mentioned by Sergio, but perhaps this is a good opportunity to also remind ourselves that when Sergio says it is not possible to delegate a normative judgment or our criteria, that helps us clarify what we're talking about. This is the moral judgment on what is right or wrong, what is more valuable or less valuable than something. Moral judgments, all of these moral type of statements are different from statements that seek to describe the real tangible world. And I think we all go back to the first 5 minutes, to the first ethics class any of us ever take. The first one describes the world, and another is moral judgment. I think that we know very well that artificial intelligence has a very important role to play in terms of rapidly processing statements that describe the world without some glitches, as you've clearly described. But there is a qualitative leap here when we move from descriptive statements about data and the scientific world into moral judgments. So perhaps that is the central point that we need to highlight as we close this session. At the end of the day, ethics review committees pass moral judgment. This benefit justifies this risk. And there's no algorithm for this. If there were an algorithm that could do this, there would be no ethics review committees. If there were just a checklist, there wouldn't be an ethics committee. There would just be somebody who looks at the checklist. So this gets to what is so unique about our work. And with the Ethics Review Committee, we are passing moral judgment. And sometimes the use of artificial intelligence has obvious limitation, but this does not mean that we can ignore these tools. There was a time when people didn't want to use computers or thought that ethical view was only on paper. If it wasn't on paper, if we weren't moving a mound of papers from here to there, it seemed that we were violating confidentiality. Once more, we have a question of how we can have responsible use of this resource so that the committee's time can be devoted more to moral decisions and not other things. And so it could handle the other aspects more expeditiously with the use of technology. There's another point that all of you have highlighted. Obviously, this is a person who will benefit from these tools. But one thing that we always like to remind ourselves is that the person who benefits from these tools needs to have enough knowledge to be able to say, well, that's a big mistake, and or this is good or that's bad. And so this requires an effort. As we close this session, I want to reiterate the urgent need to train people in working on research ethics in terms of how to analyze and justify their moral judgments. I often see nice presentations and texts on research ethics that may be done by somebody who doesn't know anything about research ethics. Since it's my area, it's really striking to you. And when we see the people who only rely on AI, don't have that background in research ethics. What we're saying here is that we want to have training in research ethics, understanding the unique character of moral judgments, and then also know how to use the resources that are available to us in order to do our jobs better. Thank you very much. And I wish you all the best for the holidays and an excellent 2026, and we'll see you next year.